even getting the social security number to solve all these issues. But one of the issues that we're doing with the students this year is I've taught them that you can think things as jokes, they become serious. So this actually has been proposed by a very serious Masada Gittin in New York, that we, for certain types of hard cases, the cases I proposed this for, where writing a name will make the get invalid according to any position, that you use social security numbers instead, in large measure because I convinced him it was his idea. But so there are all sorts of interesting ways to solve the name issue. I'll say practically, when I was in New York, we went a little crazy about this. It was really, again, we were young, and this was the issue. Even though in practice, that's really where I stopped. That's the test I never took. Was the massive study of all the names and the rules for names. And at that point, my tolerance just broke down. That's where I became a young dropout. But we used to love having these conversations on the Beit In. I got to Boston, and we're much more pragmatic. And bottom line is, if there's going to be a doubt, we just write the English name, or write Demiskuri, so and so. I got the CD, Rabbi Klapper in Newton brought back one year a CD from what they did in Israel, and you discover that this is very much one of the one of these places where halacha is in the wily coyote position, where you've gone over a cliff and you don't notice. So, right. So the thing is that every area has its own transliteration system. And the purpose is to make it recognizable, and that was great as long as you had distinct geographic areas. But in the Israeli court system, you have Sephardim and Ashkenazim and Lithuanians and Yemenites, judges just in the same circuit, just shifting in and out at night. So you look at a single beit in Israel, and you cannot, and every possible spelling, at least hopefully only possible spellings, of names shows up in every single court. So we're largely engaged in enterprise for our own integrity right now. In practice, I think it should be really, really hard for any Beit Din to invalidate any spelling that could reasonably be interpreted as accurate, because the whole notion of consistent geographic minhag has collapsed. But as no one else has looked down yet, and I try not to do so more often than necessary. Okay. So now let's suppose we're there. We have everyone's names. We know how we're going to write our names. We have had the long conversation, interesting pastoral conversation, whether we should have that conversation in the presence of the parties or not. Certainly, we have to have it in English as opposed to in Yiddish, which is one of the complaints about the Israeli court system, that people have conversations in Yiddish in front of the participants. We tend to have them in English and explain what's going on, which may or may not always be wise. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, sometimes they really get into it. Sometimes you're better off just kicking them out of the room and saying we need to discuss. So the next thing you do is called Bitul Modot. Bitul Modot is a way of solving solving any issue of any issue of prior commitments to give the get or not give the get. And it's the way in which we ensure later that the husband can't come with any claims that he engaged in this process under duress, or he engaged in this process conditionally, or any of that. So we actually have him get up and read a formal statement. If at any time I said I would give a get or would not give a get, I asked the Beit Din to relieve me from. Right, I regret having made any such statement, and I asked the Beit Din to release me from that statement. And we all say mutar lach, mutar lach, mutar lach, and all intent processes start. The complications of that process. I should say that this is something that our Beit Din used to be known in New York as the Beit Din that didn't do Bitul Modot. That was the tradition from the previous, before we call it the previous Beit Din or Beit Tannenbaum, but we have since standardized to everyone else's procedures and done it. The issue where it really comes up with is when there is a line in the civil divorce decree that mandates the divorce, and we can't release you from that commitment because you're actually in contempt if you don't do it, which is why it would really, really be much better if we devised a mechanism where instead of putting people in contempt, if they don't give the civil divorce, where we made the civil divorce conditional on the giving of a get, because you can give the key thing in all Gittin is that you're allowed to bribe somebody to give a get, you just can't blackmail them to. So if you, right, so, and Rabbi Bleich's big contribution here is that divorce is a boon of the state. The state doesn't have to allow you to divorce. So the state can put any conditions it wants and says you can't have a divorce unless you do this, and it's not halachic coercion. But once a divorce is given, if we say we'll put you in jail if you don't do this, right, that is theoretically coercion. Very happily, we have never had a circumstance in which we asked somebody why he was giving the get, and they responded, because otherwise they'll put me in jail. And in such circumstances, you can rely on the notion that even if there is a theoretical threat, but that's not why they're doing it, but it is a risk, and it would be much better if we could construct a system where there really was no external coercion, and only external bribery. I'm actually working on this now, trying to put together a continuing legal education program sometime, hopefully in the fall, which will devise a mechanism that will, at least in Massachusetts, that will take advantage of a particular quirk in Massachusetts law that hopefully makes this easy to accomplish. That you can write it in a way that the divorce, that the civil divorce, the finality will depend on the execution of the get, instead of the civil divorce decree including a penalty for not giving a get. So we do the bitul modot. In my experience, nobody has ever. Right, we explain the statement. In my experience, nobody has ever refused to read it. And that essentially takes care of all those possibilities. It's a formal mechanism by which we prevent anybody from later claiming they didn't have intent. Okay, the next thing that happens is because it says in the verse, and he will write a get, so we interpret that to mean the husband has to write it, he has to write it with his own materials. Okay, so the first thing we discover is that most husbands are not competent to write a get that looks like the picture that you have. And this is true, right? First of all, it's because most men are not capable of simply writing Hebrew k'tav ashurit. Secondly, even if they're capable of writing k'tav ashurit, they're not capable of writing k'tav ashurit with a quill pen. And thirdly, even if they're capable of writing k'tav ashurit with a quill pen, in order to catch amateurs as part of that process of centralizing and standardizing the process, we build in letters that have to be bigger, letters have to be smaller, deliberate misspellings, things like that. So the easiest way to catch an amateur is if they write a get perfectly evenly, all the letters the same and all the words spelled correctly. Right, that's how you can tell an amateur get. So unless you've actually been trained or you're a really, really good mimic, so you can copy one of these, you're unlikely to do it. So we actually have to, so there are two things we have to take place. One is that the scribe has to give the husband all the materials for the get. Right, now, because we don't want to take any chances, so all this is perfectly scripted. And really the way it takes place is you have we don't actually do it in Boston, we're a little bit influenced by the improv movement. So right, we have the script in our heads, but we actually change the words. In New York, we literally had a script, and we would hand it to the husband, and say, okay, right, you read this line, now I read this line. We didn't have dress rehearsals. So you have to get it right the first time, and it will work the way it's read. Where the husband will say something, I, so and so, son of such, right? So and so calls so and so, son of right? Son of so and so, hereby appoint you, so and so, son of so and so, scribe of the Beit Din of Boston, right? Take these materials, take this paper, ink, and quills. It's literally hands the paper to the scribe, hands the ink to the scribe, hands the quills to the scribe, lifts the ink, paper, ink, and quills above his head. Right now, go on. Say, write with it a get for me and my wife. Right, for me, so and so divorced with my wife. Everything is totally scripted. Everything's done by agency. The really interesting thing is that if you look at the halakha, it will tell you that you can write it in any handwriting you want, and any alphabet you want, and on any material you want. And but because we want to eliminate amateurs and we want to eliminate ambiguity, so we have totally standardized it. It has to be written with a quill, using standard inks, standard halachic inks, on paper. Now, why on paper and not on parchment? Because once upon a time we didn't have enough parchment. Not having enough parchment, we had to write it on paper, which we could. If we had gone back to parchment, we were afraid that people would suggest that the inks that had been written on paper would be invalid. So once we had switched to paper, we mandated staying with paper. Right? And this is really one of the principles we have all the way through. It's called to be motzi laz al gitin you're not allowed to be motzi lazal gitin harishonim. You're never allowed to do anything that suggests any previous get was invalid. So once, or whatever necessity you have to adopt a particular practice, you make sure that everybody adopts that practice forever. So we don't allow getting to be written on parchment anymore. Everything has to be written on paper, and this comes from a cool story in the Talmud where somebody was an agent, and the question was, as an agent, how much of the get do I have to be there for? And the first person told him he should be there for the whole get. The second person told him, essentially, you have to hear the quill scratch against the paper once. And then he said, you might want to be machmir and stay there the whole time. You're not allowed to stay there the whole time, because that will suggest that you have to stay there the whole time. When somebody else comes and says, I only heard the ink scratching, then we'll say the get is invalid, so leave. Because we're always terribly concerned not just about this get, but about every previous get. Okay.
So it's still written by the scribe.
It's written by the scribe. But it's all the husband gives a very specific charge to the scribe, right? And the husband gives all the material. The scribe gives all the materials to the husband as an absolute gift. That's why it's always in the script. Right? Here, give this to you as an absolute gift, and then the husband gives them back to the scribe. And at the end, you have to remember to ask the husband to give you back the stuff so you can use it for the next divorce. Because otherwise it belongs to him instead of to the scribe. Right? So that's one of the things we almost always just about forget. And at the last minute, someone remembers. Right? Let's remember to ask him for the leftover paper ink, and quills. You also have to make sure that we're correct. So the script has been very, very carefully written to cover any ambiguity. So, for example, if he has to tell the scribe, write one get or many gittin, until one will be valid in the sight of the rabbis. Right? Because he might think he only told you to write one get, didn't tell you to write two. And you have to write very carefully until one will be valid in the eyes of the rabbis presiding at this session, so he can't come back later and say, well, you guys made him write a second get, but those guys over there tell me the first get was kosher, so your thing doesn't work. Right? So everything is written right, with complete contract lawyer detail. Right? So the script is perfectly valid, and like most cases, that means that you create a presumption that it happened that way. So you don't have to record the session and demonstrate it. Unless somebody produces a recording in which it's obvious you left out a line of the script, we assume that everything happened according to the script. Okay. Now, so let's take a look at one of the really fun Gemaras that are worth. We take a look at the page that begins Mishnah Gittin, chapter 3, 1 to 2. So we have a really interesting list of fun cases in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that the get has to be written for the sake of the woman, but then it gives you three cases. The first case is you're wandering through the marketplace, and you hear scribes dictating a practice get. And guess what? It's your name, and your wife's name. And you say, hey, it's probably cheaper this way. Can I have that get? So it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it wasn't written for the sake of divorce. Okay, now I have a second case. What happens is you order a get, and then you think better of it. You don't really want to divorce your wife. But your friend, who has the same name as you, and the same father's name, and who married somebody with the same name as your wife, and is that right? So he says to you, can I have that get that you're not using anymore? So that get doesn't work either. Because even though it was written for the sake of divorce, it was written l'shem gerushin. It was not written. It was not written for you. It was written for the other guy. But what happens if you have two wives with identical names, identical father's names? So now it's just you. It's just a question of, right? I thought I would divorce wife number one, but really I'm going to divorce wife number two. Why shouldn't that work? No, that doesn't work because you have to. Right, the get has to be written for the sake of divorce, for the sake of this man divorcing, or for the sake of this man divorcing this woman. Okay, then the Mishnah comes up with one more case, which is what happens if you say to the sofer, I have two wives, they have the same name, and I don't know which one I want to divorce yet. Right, so that plays out in a general question whether we believe in a concept called fate or destiny, brera, where you can say that it becomes clear afterwards you have your intent. This is where the Gemara is borrowing from the story of Jephthah's daughter, right? If he says, I will divorce whichever one comes out of my house first. Right? So that doesn't work either. But what emerges from that is that we say that a get has to have three intents. It has to be written for the sake of divorce, for the sake of this man, and for the sake of that woman. So therefore, the instruction to the sofer who will write the get, the instruction to the witnesses who will sign the get, always have to state, write this for me, insert full name, to divorce my wife, insert full name, and write it lishmi, for my sake, lishma, for her sake, l'shem gerushin, and for the sake of a Jewish divorce. And we always say those words in Hebrew, lishmi, lishma. Unfortunately, Rabbi Halfinger, alav shalom, whenever he said lishma, he had an accent that it always sounded to the people listening as if he had said lishmor. And so we would always have these games reminiscent of the famous Get Smart episode, where not craw, right? They would never get not lishmor. He would say, yes, lishmor, no, not lishmor. Just go on it. Eventually, you kind of hope to get it right, and you translate it properly anyway, so it would work. But accents or lishmoa, something that came out of lishmoa also. So that's not much you can do about that.
In a case where you have to have two wives, same names, following, so there's nothing in the document to distinguish the women, I guess?
There's no.
Would you try to make something in the document?
No.
Mother of this one, not that one,
Name your kids.
So the Gemara talks about what happened. Right? We don't allow the possibility that two people, that because there's someone else with the same name, divorce is impossible. We just assume it's really, really unlikely. That's all. When a case like that happens, we don't do anything. The only possible solution is social security numbers. But some crazy guy suggested that once. You can mention grandfathers, but at some point there's always going to be a theoretical possibility of identical twins whose parents decided to, whatever it may be. So it's unlikely enough it doesn't bother us. Okay. So then the scribe goes off and actually writes the get. So if you go back to the actual picture of the get, so we'll go through what actually happens in the get. So you see the first thing is the date, and the date is perfectly scripted in Shulchan Aruch. First you talk about the day of the week, which is written as X number of days of Shabbat. And then you talk about the days of the month, X number of days of the month, and you write the year in a very particular fashion. You write it from creation. Right. This is the year since Briat Olam, the year of creation, according to the count that we keep here in. So this get was written in New York, a city that rests on the Al Kaif Yama, on the seashore, the Al Nahar Hudson, and on the Hudson River. Because the standard process is you have to identify the location in which the get is being written. You have to identify it by two bodies of water. Boston is Masa de Yaspel Cape Yama Vel Nahar Charles, which is spelled Charles. Obviously, this creates all sorts of issues in desert environments, and there's a wonderful article by Aryeh Kaplan, which I believe is called "A Get in Swan." Is it a get in Spring Valley or something like that? You need to standardize the name of a place so that you never write a get spontaneously in a new place. You always recall all sorts of great experts out to figure out how everything should be spelled, and that's why our Beit Din has to be in Boston, because the name Boston has been established. There might or might not be establishments for Newton and Brookline and Sharon. It's easier to just use Boston. Masud Yasfel, Keif Yamamal, Nahar Charles. Aryeh Kaplan has a wonderful article. I believe the problem in Spring Valley was that there was a body of water which was called Lake Suzanne, but the problem is Lake Suzanne was not really a lake. It was really a river, or it was artificially created. I forget which. One of those issues, and then it was only within the city limits according to the political map, but not according to the utilities map or vice versa, and this took like 7 years to settle. They ended up writing the Har Lake Suzanne, right? Right, the river known as Lake Suzanne as opposed to Lake Suzanne, and deciding. So these are really, this is really a big issue. We are comfortable, Masriya, Boston, Masriya, Yasval, Kef Yom, Nahar Charles. Then you write the name of the person, Anoah, Ploni, and you see here they have it in Miskari, etc. And then after, right, then you write the name, Aunt Intasi, right, here my wife, and you give all her names, if she's present, right, as it was in this case. It says, if you look at the end of line 6, and the get always has to take exactly 12 lines. And the last line is standard, so no matter how long the name is, that's the trick of a sofer. A sofer has to be able to fit the whole get into 12 lines, even if somebody has a name, is Engelbert, also called Engel, also called Franklin, also called so-and-so, son of, right, so-and-so, 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 so-and-so. Doesn't matter, everything has to get into 12 lines, right, little or right big.
No line.
The get has to be rectangular as opposed to square. Right, so it has to be longer this way than that way. That's really the only, but the thing is that you inscribe the lines, you inscribe the margins before you start. So the sofer, right? So the sofer has to know the name, and it has to be really good. If you look, sofers that aren't so much experienced, they'll be either really little letters that are squeezed into the end of the line, or one of these dollars that takes up a whole line. It's a really long letter. You get extra points if you have if you can find ways in which you interweave in every line letters that go up and every letters that go down, so that nobody could sneak a line in between. Right, that's bonus points. Okay, at the end it tells you, right? Right now at the end of line 7, right? So it says the Havis Intasi, starting line 8, min kidmas danan, you were my wife previously. Uchido, you'll see that the word chido, even though that's a vav, is a really big letter and goes both above and beyond. Again, that's how you catch the amateurs if they write a standard vav. Pitaris, right? So you are freed, ushivakis, and sent to a seruchis, and right, yasichi lichi, right? There's like 10 languages of divorce, and all in Aramaic. And then you get the end of line 10, and it says v'harei muteres l'chol adam. All of a sudden in Hebrew. So how did that happen? It's bad, because if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, you'll see there's a rule that a get can't be written in multiple languages. But we actually started off in Hebrew also, we said, right? B'sheni, b'shabbos, etc. So this is really problematic. The way it happened, and okay, we'll finish up in 5 minutes. The way it happened is as follows. You can look at this on a source sheet. The Gemara says that when you write, they used to have form gittin apparently, where even though it's complicated, they probably didn't have quite the same limitations as to how tight it had to be then. So you would write a get and just leave blank spaces for the names. So what are the things you have to leave blank? What are the things that really have to be written lishma? So the answer is you have to leave the name, you have to leave the date, the place, and the names. And then somebody adds in the Gemara and says you also have to leave the place of harei muter l'chol adam. Now what he almost certainly meant by that was you have to leave the language of divorce out, and you have to write the language of divorce l'shem gerushin. But Rabbi Tam came along and said, you know what? Maybe it means a get has to say harei muter l'chol adam. So Rabbi Tam put in the practice that every get had to include harei muter l'chol adam. Tosfot then says, isn't that motzi laz al gittin and rishonim? Aren't we invalidating the previous get? No, everybody knew that it wasn't really necessary. He just did it anyway. So that's why we have a get which has every possible language the Gemara ever mentioned for divorce, including the Hebrew harei muter l'chol adam. Then we have a whole list of really interesting answers as to why it's not a violation of being written in multiple languages, ranging from hey, they're really one language, to it only means you can't write sentences in different languages. You can write words in different languages. Harei muter l'chol adam looks like an independent clause, but really is a dependent clause. Right, all sorts of fun conversations. Yes, Jessica?
It's also not true because you can't marry a Kohen.
Yes, it's also not true. This is actually a big issue we have continually as to how you translate the English harei muter l'chol adam. Right, because when the get is written, so the husband or the agent faces the wife and says, "This is your get, and accept this get, and with it you shall be divorced from me or divorced from him, as of now." And you are permitted to marry. And here we have an ongoing battle on Beit whether you're supposed to say to marry another man, which is true, but not a translation of Kol Adam. or any man, which is not true but a correct translation. Now, there is no real way out of that. You can take your pick. Right? Whether you'd rather write, do you have an accurate translation or an accurate description? Yes, Roger.
Why 12 lines?
Why what?
Why 12 lines?
Well, because if you take the Gimel is 3 and the Tet is 9, you get 12.
Okay.
Yeah. It really is, the word get doesn't really mean divorce, the word get means contract. It's just one of those things put into catch action.
And you're really concerned about forgeries,
Yeah.
but since any husband could basically write this and give it to his divorce without the date, then
We would almost certainly, unless there was a circumstance of Igun, you would almost certainly find ways to invalidate it. Because there's so many ways to invalidate a get if you want to.
like it might have Hebrew and Aramaic.
It might hear Aramaic, all the letters have to be perfect. Right? You have a crack in the letter like a Sefer Torah. Right? The letters are discontinuous. Right? That doesn't count. And really, the fundamental issue is how can you demonstrate that you wrote the get lishma? Right? You can't demonstrate your intent. Since the validity of a get depends on them being written with intent. So the only way you can demonstrate intent is by saying this was done in a competent form. Right? That's really why it has to be centralized, because once you require intent, so then there's really the document itself can never be sufficient proof of divorce, because the document can't demonstrate intent. It's only the production of the document in a recognized forum that can demonstrate intent. That's why everything has to take place. That's why everything has to take place in Beit Din. Okay, so now we actually get to the point where you give over the divorce. So there the Torah says you give it into her hand. So obviously you don't. We never let you do that because we are fanatic fundamentalists and we don't actually allow you to follow the Torah literally. And here's why. Because let's suppose here's a get. Okay, so now the husband gives it to the wife. Did the husband give it to the wife, or did the wife take it from the husband? Right, there's a moment where they're both touching it. And then you can't tell whether his hand withdrew or her hand took it out. So actually you cannot allow it to be given, so what you do is this. Right, sorry, you can't. Right, what you do is the husband has to drop it, but he can't let go because that would not be a gift. So he has to engage in a downward motion and release it, so that part of the momentum is imparted by his motion, and it goes into her hand. And that is an unfortunate implication, which is worth pointing out, that it ends up with a circumstance that is unfortunate because you have the wife standing like this in front of the husband, and if it's not explained why you're doing them, that looks like a position of supplication. But it's really just there, so that the husband can drop it into her hand as opposed to giving it. Also, you have to make the wife remove all her jewelry, so he drops it into her hand, as opposed to in something that obstructs her hand.
Does it ever happen in mechanics so that just fails? It falls on the floor and then
You have to do it again.
it's still his though? It's not hers?
Yeah, actually, once she catches it, then you have to go through a whole series of things that demonstrate unchallenged ownership, which are, take a tour. Right, you can't grab it. You take a tour. You take it. You hold it like this. You hold it. You put it under your arm. You lift it over your head. And you walk out of the room, and no one stops you. Right, you walk out of the room holding it. No one stops you. Now it's yours. Right, so that demonstrates that it's yours. Yes, Naomi.
What if the wife doesn't have hands?
What if the wife doesn't have hands? No, I haven't thought of that. It comes up in Chalitza, right, with double amputees, which is really a big problem. It's a famous case where the Rav actually allowed Hilo because he couldn't do Chalitza, because he couldn't wear a shoe. But I have not seen a discussion of what happens if a wife doesn't. I know what you do. Because we treat the word yad as a metaphor, and you can use the wife's property. You can give it to the wife. So either appoint an agent, right?
Appoint an agent.
Appoint an agent, or you can use her property. Yeah, I think that would be the. Although agents are challenging because agents can't normally do things you can't do, so that's a whole. Right? So it might be you have to. I don't know. It might be you have to use the wife's courtyard. Okay, the last two things are we should say that many batei din not always ours, require the wife to give up her claim to the ketubah as before the delivery of the get. That is an issue that becomes a flashpoint often in contemporary critiques of the Beit Din system, so it's worth explaining. The reason they do that is because you don't want the wife to come back later and say, after the civil divorce, and say, hey, you owe me the money for the ketubah, and the husband says, if I had known that I owed you the money for the ketubah, then I would never have given the get, and so the fight starts over again. You would never require the wife to give up the ketubah in a circumstance where the Beit Din actually controlled the financial outcome. Right? If you're dealing with a circumstance where the ketubah is unenforceable, and where almost certainly the settlement from a civil court will be greater than the ketubah anyway. So what you're doing is you're preventing the wife from double dipping, saying we'll go through the civil negotiations, and then after the final civil divorce, then I'll claim my ketubah. Right, which runs the risk that the husband will then withdraw, will then challenge the get. But that, I think, often in contemporary critiques of Beit Din, because it's perceived like this, it's perceived as if that is the court forcing the woman to give up whatever rights she has, and it generates all sorts of critiques. So it's valuable knowing that the only reason it's done is to protect the woman from a subsequent claim by the husband that had he known there was this outstanding debt, he would never have done it. But that has to be explained carefully. And the last thing that has to happen after the get, so both parties are asked whether they do this willingly. You ask the wife, right before you end the get, you have to ask the wife whether she's doing this of her own free will, because we rule, like Rabbi Gershon, that we don't allow divorce by either party against their will, except in really, really unusual circumstances. At the end, you have to, the wife signs the get and says she accepted her own free will. It's an interesting question at what point in the process you inform the parties of the consequences of divorce, which are two things. A, that the wife can't remarry a Kohen. B, that the husband can't marry any of the wife's relatives. Usually when you explain those simultaneously, that one is a comic line. But the Kohen is not a comic line, and so it's not really, it doesn't work so well. And secondly, that they have to be very careful not to live as husband and wife thereafter, but to treat each other as unmarried people, which is complicated when they have joint custody. Right, how you handle drop-offs and things like that. So a really interesting question is at what point in the process you need to inform people of that, because there is always a risk that you can turn people off and they won't go through if you explain it. I tend to think that transparency in advance is always the best strategy. So my understanding of best practice is that when a couple comes in, I take them through the entire process, including the end. But there are cases where that really raises eyebrows. On the other hand, I just can't deal with telling people that after the divorce and say, by the way, you should know that you just became usher to marry a Kohen. That doesn't seem to work very well to me. Okay, so that pretty much is how the process is. Let's take a few questions, but I think we're over time. Okay, so whatever. Yaakov, you have a question?
Yeah, about what Rabbeinu Tam says about Aryeh Matar L'Kol Adam.
Yeah.
The Gemara and the Daring, they say Gufo shall get is Aryeh Matar L'Kol Adam.
Yeah, but we paskin again, right? Even according to Rabbeinu Tam, we paskin that means you have to say something like Aryeh Matar L'Kol Adam.
That doesn't seem like Pshat in the Gemara.
Okay, you think Rabbeinu Tam is pshat, but then your Motzi Lazel getting Rishonim, so you don't want to say that.
No, they knew it all.
Yeah, right. It has to be a language that meets the criteria of kritut. So there can't be any right. You can't say I divorce you except unless you marry that man. Rather, you have to find ways out of that. But we have to rule that if it left out Aryeh Matar L'Kol Adam, it would still be kasher. Although nowadays, if you left out Aryeh Matar L'Kol Adam, that would be a red flag that you weren't really doing it right. Yes.
Have you ever used the loophole in Kiddushin to say they're never married by saying that he never had ownership over the ring?
Have we ever used? I mean, do we ever use an element? No. We could talk about this other time. The whole Laguna thing. It's not practical. Almost never. It's not practical for individual Beit Din to do something like that, because you have, right. If you ever want to pull something like that, you have to have a broad consensus, because you want the woman to be able to remarry. Right, and she doesn't have a get. So so she comes to remarry, she has to explain, that Beit Din said that they did X. Right, so so anything like that you have to use a consensus. It's really rare that you would have to use anything that radical. Hopefully we'll tease that hopefully over the next couple of weeks, I'll be writing a weekly piece, which will try and explain outlines of the Aguna circumstance, and I think week 3 is scheduled to be an outlining of all the annulment techniques and solutions for them, right, and why they work or don't work. But for our Beit Din, we have, I say often, we did, with the Rabbanut once, we did use a different trick that accomplishes the same thing, which is to instead of handing the document to a woman, to throw it in her direction, so that it lands closer to her but in the public domain, which creates which is another circumstance where the Gemara says that creates that would create put the woman in a situation of doubtful divorce, and therefore we annul the wedding. So we did that once with the Rabbanut to solve a mamzeret case. But we've never had an Aguna case that required that. We've always solved Aguna cases without that. Okay. I guess that's, thank you all very much for listening, and we'll be back next week for theoretical approach to conversion, and the week after that, we'll actually do the practical.